Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today, brought to you by AI Group.
Yes, hello, I'm James Scotland and this is Supply Circles. Today I'm very excited, really excited. Not only are we going to address a fascinating issue that concerns business and supply chain managers everywhere, but I also get to chat with a fascinating and interesting human being. I'm talking with my friend of 25 years and we're going to talk about the future. Not our future, that's already predetermined to be a future of fine food, thick steaks, good wines and long chats late into the night. No, today we're going to deep dive into a key part of supply chains that we rarely think about, but that impacts all of us. And we're going to look at the changes that are ahead. My guest is Michael Kilgariff, the Chief Executive Officer of Roads Australia, and that's ROADS, as in roads and highways. Hello, Michael. Welcome to the show.
James, thanks for the invitation. Really appreciate it. Great to see you again.
Over the last few months, Supply Circles has looked at many parts of supply chain management. We've looked at the keys to modern day procurement with Andy Brightmore. We've looked at the first steps to decarbonise your business with Dr. Kate Brooks, at operating structured supply chains in times of ambiguity, and much more. We discovered there's a lot to what's called supply chains in our business, and we've discovered it impacts many parts, if not every part of our business. But let's be serious. Underpinning it all is the fundamental need of supply chains to move goods. Jonathan Kempe was recently on the show talking about the future of the global shipping container industry. And today I want to add to that by talking about what's happening on the ground. I want to talk about the future of cars, of trucks, roads, and particularly the infrastructure and the planning that is going into preparing for our future. Moving ourselves, our staff and materials and our finished goods across town and across the country is critical to the success of our business. But the way we do this is changing rapidly because the way we live and the way we work has changed. From the days when everyone worked 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and shopped on weekends at supermarkets, we moved to where most of us are working from home for most or all of the time, to online shopping for everything from computers to home goods to nightly dinners and McDonald's and even alcohol. And all of it is getting delivered. These things have changed the way we use our roads and our transport. It's changed peak traffic flows. And it's changed the way we run our businesses and our supply lines. In fact, many businesses now need to design and manage last mile deliveries. And they need to manage returns via a process called reverse logistics. We need to move goods into and out of suburbs rather than just into and out of warehouses and supermarkets. And there's more. New cars such as electric vehicles require new infrastructure, and net zero carbon targets mean that roads need to be built to achieve net zero. If we as business people are going to hit zero, we need our deliveries to also be at zero. So there's a lot to talk about. These are big issues, and we need a living legend to unpack it for us. Cue Michael Kilgariff, the man, the legend. Michael is the perfect person to chat about this. He's a trained economist. He's run businesses. He's worked in policy and strategy. He's worked with large transport operators, port operators, and large logistic operations. And for the last few years, he's been the CEO of Roads Australia, as many of these issues have become clearer. So, Michael, it sounds like you and Roads Australia have an important part to play in the building of resilient supply chains. Do you think I've sufficiently confused our listeners as to what the issues are that you're facing?
Look, I think it's all of that, but it's also a little bit more in that from a roads perspective or from a transport perspective, the public policy debate now is much more around the mobility of goods and people. So it's not so much about how we move them on roads. It's basically how we move them from A to B, and that can involve roads, it can involve rail, and of course, from a logistics perspective, it even involves white vans and even people delivering goods to shops and businesses on trolleys. So it's much more now around mobility. But the other thing that, of course, is happening is that there's a number of different policy issues that are emerging at the same time, and that is that, of course, we've now got a big focus on zero emissions and emissions reduction, zero emissions vehicles. But at the same time, and of course that involves electric vehicles and other zero-emission sources such as hydrogen. But at the same time, we've also got this fascinating thing emerging with connected and automated vehicles. So while we're also talking about electric vehicles, we're also talking about how these vehicles that are actually going to be connected to each other and even automated in the future, how they're going to actually move around the system and how they'll move both goods and people around our cities and around the country. So some really fascinating issues that are emerging now around this whole mobility issue.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I remember before COVID, years ago, you and I were at a Logan City Council in Brisbane meeting where you had some engineers talking about just simply changing roads and the exits and egress, or the egress and the entrance to highways can change how long a travel time is. That's just the starting point. But then when you start talking about the stuff that you're talking about, it's quite a complex issue. I wanted to ask about, you did your training, if I remember correctly, at ANU in economics. And Shane Rogers, who's our Chief Operating Officer, you know, Shane, he recently wrote an article where he said that we don't know enough about economics as a population. We need to understand economics a bit more. He said where social and economic reform is charging up the agenda, we need to understand the nature of wealth creation and job creation, because this is all about having an economic model underpinning the solutions that we're going to need. In other words, all the issues that you're talking about need to move past a political or a opinion type thing into a hard economic model. One of the issues that you're facing, of course, is that a lot of infrastructure is funded by taxes that are based around fuel, the fuel excise, cars. And if we take that out of the equation, it's difficult to fund it. How are you looking at those sort of issues? How are you looking at the future of funding infrastructure?
Yeah, look, great question. I mean, fundamentally, economics for me is about the best allocation of resources, really. And resources, of course, are people, but it's also taxpayers' dollars and its effort. It's an interesting one when it comes to fuel excise, because the fuel excise that is levied in Australia, which is largely, I guess, hidden, if you like, in that most people don't really actually understand how much fuel excise they pay. There's no real, then, I guess, connection between where the fuel excise is levied and where it's spent. And with the emergence of electric vehicles, we're going to see less and less fuel excise actually being levied. So while we've now got fuel excise that's levied, it goes into consolidated revenue and then is allocated by governments. There's now a shortfall between what's required and what's being spent, especially around issues such as maintenance. Countries like Norway, which have had a very, very aggressive and successful policy of encouraging the uptake of EVs, to the extent that most of the cars that are now sold in Norway are actually electric vehicles, are now reaching crunch point in terms of the fact that now the fuel excise that was levied previously to actually pay for the roads that these cars drive down is diminishing and diminishing rapidly. So we need to come up with a better way to be able to, I guess, fund the infrastructure that we need to ensure that these cars, whether they be automated or they be EVs or both, how they move around the network. So that's going to be a massive issue. And some of the governments like Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia have already started to address this issue, where they're going to try and levy, I guess, a user pays approach to the use of EVs. Now, that's going to be difficult in that obviously we want to, on the one hand, encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, so we want to keep them as cheap as possible. But on the other hand, we also need to put in place some of those longer-term policies that are going to deal with some of the ramifications of the growth of the EV market in Australia. So there's some really interesting policy work going on around that now.
Yeah, the Norway issue is interesting, isn't it? Because they encouraged, through fiscal policy, the purchases of electric vehicles and discouraged internal combustion engine vehicles. And now all of a sudden they're saying, well, hang on, that fiscal policy was good short term, but long term it's creating some issues. I want to get to those bigger issues that you mentioned at the start shortly, but let's just stay here for a minute. One of the challenges for you must be that, if I understand it correctly, you've got to work with federal, state, and local councils. I read where there's 550 local councils in Australia that look after about 75% of Australia's road network. And it's complex anyway. There's 5 states and 3 territories. 550 councils, one federal government that changes every 4 years. How do you sort of work your way through that to try and get a policy that is coherent and makes sense? Or do we just stumble along as we always have?
Well, it's a combination of a number of different things. I think that generally good policy should be policy that's adopted by any government, regardless of their political colour. Now, obviously, they will bring a certain perspective to particular policy issues that you need to be aware of and try to deal with. But generally, we just try to develop what we consider to be good public policy that's in the interests of both of Australia, both from an economic and social perspective. And look, there was a Labor government in Victoria. There is a Labor government in Victoria that was the first to introduce some of those road user charges. New South Wales, of course, a Liberal National government also followed suit. So good policy really should apply regardless of what the political colour of the government is. But, I mean, you're dead right in saying that we've got that Commonwealth government who generally, from a funding perspective, is the provider of the funds. We've got state governments who are generally, and I say generally because obviously there's some crossover, are generally the governments that spend those funds maintaining the infrastructure that we own, and also give some funding to local governments in addition to their own revenue to maintain their own road network. But it's a complex system when you start to think about a national road network that respects neither state boundaries or local government boundaries, and yet everybody expects that infrastructure will be maintained to a certain standard.
I think back in all the years I was frustrated when I was running businesses with government regulations getting in my way, and then I think about the challenges that you've got, and I feel like I was whinging for no reason. I think you've got a big task on hand, although far be it from me to whinge for no reason. The obvious question from there is, are we ready for changes? Because, governments around the world struggled with Uber coming in, with Airbnb. Technology changes create problems with old style of regulations. Are we in Australia ready for the technology changes that you flagged ahead? Are we in a position that we can manage it? And how's that relates to the rest of the world?
And what will it look like? Look, I think we are, and certainly, as we speak, COP27 is currently being held, and there's lots of debates going on around reducing emissions. What we're going to see in Australia, I think, is that we're lagging behind in terms of the uptake of electric vehicles, but that's actually going to drive more than just issues with more EVs on the roads and what we're going to do with road funding, because what that's also going to drive is this convergence between transport, energy and technology, where the energy system, which is largely developed similar but completely differently to the transport system, in that they're both networks. They've both actually been rolled out over a considerable amount of time. Lots of money has been spent on them, but there's not a lot of convergence between them. So what we're going to be seeing in the future is, effectively, as we've got electric vehicles running around the system, both drawing down and also putting energy back into the energy market, the energy system is going to have to adapt to that. And the technology that we're going to need, both in terms of making sure that these vehicles are paying for the infrastructure, but also how we manage that use of the energy system in the energy market. I mean, one of the interesting things about the electricity market, of course, is that while roads are designed to drive two ways, the electricity system is designed for the energy to flow from the point of generation to the point of use, be it domestic or commercial. But what's going to happen in the future is that you're going to need that two-way flow, because you're going to have embedded generation, but you're also going to have that mobile generation of EVs running around the system. And so for me, this is probably going to be one of the big changes that the energy system is going to have to deal with, not only in terms of renewables, but in terms of how we're going to deal with all of these mobile batteries running around the network. Because at the moment, they tend to, in my view, be focused a little bit in the short term. They run on 5-year, regulatory regimes. It's probably a little bit too long nowadays, in that we don't really know what the system's going to look like in 5 years' time. So, look, I think we're adequately placed to do it, and we can do it. But yeah, there does need to be a little bit more focus on some of those issues that we're talking about.
It's, I just love this whole idea, and let's talk about that in a sec. But this whole idea that electric vehicles, battery vehicles, have got stored power, and it doesn't just burn energy like we do with carbon-based fuels. Someone explained it to me as, imagine that you had 5,000 cars sitting outside the Pentagon in the US. Well, that's 5,000 battery packs sitting there, and the car's smart enough to say, I need 13% charge to get back to my home. So here, have 60% of my battery power because I don't need it until I get home. So you got 5,000 cars throwing power into a network, and they're only keeping enough to get home because the car's smart. It's a completely different way of looking at it, and it really shows how dumb current vehicles are. We're still using 1890 technology of compressed gas making an explosion and driving some clunky gears. My car's pretty smart, but it's still just basically 6,000 explosions every minute to drive a clunky gear system. New cars will be smart. Hey, before we get any further, one of the things that every sector is struggling with is skilled employees. And a lot of industries are poaching from other industries. We're poaching similar ones. I would imagine as an industry organisation, you're trying to figure out how you're going to have enough skilled staff as we build the infrastructure of the future.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, that capacity issue that you just raised there is quite a big issue. I mean, as you know, all governments have got massive transport infrastructure programs underway. We've got tunnels underway in every major capital, bridges, roads, significant upgrades and improvements to rail networks. And so this is an industry that's under a lot of pressure to deliver. And certainly coming out of COVID, it hasn't backed up. Infrastructure Australia a couple of years ago forecasted that by now we would be short about 100,000 people, as in that there would be 100,000 jobs that would not be filled. Now, the mining industry at the moment says that they have about 70,000 jobs that won't be filled. And so effectively what's happening is that all of these different infrastructure industries are looking to the others to, or even within the industry, to each other's companies to try and get the resources that they need. So there's some big issues coming up in terms of skilled migration, making sure that we've got training to deliver on the infrastructure promises that we've made. But even in terms of, getting back to EVs, the fact that if we're actually now going to increase the number of electric vehicles in the industry, we're going to need electricians to be installing all the charging points. We need auto electricians or similar to be able to actually maintain these cars. There's some significant skills challenges that we've got right now, but a lot more coming over the horizon.
I do some work in the defence industry, building a defence network in Western Sydney, and they're saying they're going to need thousands of new people in the defence industry, not just in defence, but in the defence industry, But you're also going to need people in construction as we rebuild after COVID. But to do that, we need people in the mines to operate the mines. It's just a fascinating area, and I think there's big challenges ahead. And meanwhile, of course, every single small business is saying, I just can't get skilled staff anyway. So we've got this challenge of current staff versus the new skills of the future, and all of it is coming to a head.
Yeah, we've got some very unique economic challenges at the moment. Low unemployment, high inflation, and that's going to pose some really considerable issues for the government.
Will that slow down the infrastructure build? Or would that slow down what your industry is doing, rethinking the way it's going to work in the future?
Well, look, it's possible. I mean, the forward estimates are only ever 4 years. So anything that's basically forecasted to be spent beyond 4 years is only, technically a promise. But there is so much infrastructure underway at the moment that you can't really actually get halfway through a project and stop. All you can do is maybe expand out the timeline. And generally, I've got to say that the industry is not completely opposed to the idea that governments actually stretch it out a bit, just to make sure that from a capacity perspective, it can be delivered. But look, the billions of dollars forecasted to be spent over the next 10 years, we expect will be done, because these projects, have been talked about for a long time, and many of them are now actually underway.
So it's going to happen. It's all going to happen.
Look, it will happen, but one of the things that you did see in the budget that the Commonwealth Government handed down a few weeks back was the fact that they actually did just push out some of the timelines for some of these jobs. And look, from an industry perspective, as I said, we're not opposed to that, because sometimes, let's face it, projects in terms of timelines are adjusted according to, other needs other than what is actually physically possible to deliver. And the fact that a number of projects go over time and over budget is perhaps a good example of how that happens.
Let's talk about cars for a second, and then we'll move on to some other big issues that pick up on what you've just been talking about, I think. The thing that fascinates me most about motor vehicles is that we've got this love of, we have a current love of owning cars. And yet we don't use them very well. I was reading somewhere that in Europe, 92% of the time the car's parked, 5% of the time it's driving, and 1.6% of the time it's looking for parking. In London, this is staggering. In London, there are 27 million trips every day across London, 27 million. And about half of them are in motor vehicles. The rest are in walking, cycling or public transport. There are cars in Australia. The average car in Australia travels 11,000 kilometres, so about 1,000 kilometres a month, not very much. And yet we have massive congestion. We've got 29% congestion in Melbourne, 34% in Sydney, 38% in Vancouver. All this means that we don't use our cars very well, and there seems to be this emergence of an idea that we don't need to own cars anymore, the emergence of mobility on demand and mobility as a service. The idea that after a while I'm looking at the cost of fuel, I'm looking at how I'm living my life, I'm getting my TV on demand, I'm getting everything on demand. And after a while you start saying, hang on, why do I have my car sitting there? Why don't I just have mobility on demand? What's that about? Is that emerging? Is that a real thing?
Well, look, it may come as a surprise to you and your listeners that as the CEO of Roads Australia, I actually do not even own a car. Now, my wife does. If I need to go down to Bunnings on the weekend, I've always got the option to be able to do that. But I'm fortunate. I live near a railway station. My work is near a railway station. I catch the train or use other ways of getting around. And for me, that actually came about 4 years ago when my lease on my car came up. And I just let it go for a couple of months thinking I'd get around to it, and then eventually realised that, in fact, I didn't need a car. And so for me, it's real. Look, I think in the future, or in the very near future, It's going to be a significant issue, I think, when we talk about connected and automated vehicles as well, in that do we really actually, if connected and automated vehicles are actually going to be a solution, do we actually still just want the same thing except you're just not driving it? And I think personally that we will see a much bigger focus on the idea of joint mobility, if you like, of people don't need to own a car. They can actually order one in or catch public transport or, get a scooter or whatever it might be. That, I think, is what the transport system of the future will look like.
Yeah, I think so. Makes sense to me. I think one of the things in COVID was the same thing that you went through, where people were sitting at home a lot and looking at their cars, saying, "Hang on, why do I have $100,000 tied up in a vehicle that I don't use?" And then Uber makes things easier and those sort of things, where you just ring up and say, "Come and move me." After the break, let's talk about those things, future mobility and what the future looks like. Back soon.
If you have supply chain or business improvement challenges, contact AI Group's Business Improvement and Growth Hub. The Big Hub is a library of practical and relevant resources designed to assist member businesses to grow and improve. The Big Hub also includes an extensive network of experienced, pre-qualified business improvement consultants. For more details, contact big@aigroup.com.au. That's big@aigroup.com.au.
Hey, Michael, this is a good chat. I'm enjoying it. One of the things that I've heard talked about is this idea of the use of the curb. What's all that about?
Well, the curbside, especially in a CBD, is actually quite an important social and also economic asset. And we're having increasingly a lot more debates around the idea of, do we allow people to actually park on the curb? If so, how do we charge for that? Should curbs be more about actually just picking up and dropping off? How do we actually use the curb to make sure that we maximise even our freight network? And so curbside policy doesn't sound very interesting, but it's in fact one that all city councils in particular are devoting quite a lot of their attention to make sure that they keep the traffic flow moving in the CBD and that people aren't just basically parking on streets and really at the end of the day not actually delivering any benefit other than congesting the street.
Should we still have, cars parking in the city, or should, some cities have said you can't come in, you have to use public transport. Is that likely to be the future of Australia, where we don't see cars as the main form of mobility? Yeah.
Look, my personal view is that you don't need to be parking your car on the curbside in the CBD. The curbside should be utilised for basically maximum social and economic benefit. And that economic benefit is all about the freight. And how do we make sure that all of those, the shops, the restaurants, the bars, all of those important things that are part of a cosmopolitan lifestyle, that they're well and truly catered to. But it's really a waste to have people parking on the curb for hours of the day where the car's not being used, and unfortunately neither is the curb.
Yeah. Utilising the resources for the benefit of everyone. Well, you're talking about connected vehicles before, and it's one of my favourite subjects, this idea about what the car of the future looks like. I've heard an electric vehicle described as being an iPad on wheels. It's basically this computer, that went from a mainframe, then onto a laptop, then onto our watches, then into our hands, and now it's a car. And it's not like a car of the past. In fact, someone once said to me that the electric vehicle of the next few years will have as much connection to the cars of the past as a record player, the old LPs, has to Spotify. There's just no real connection apart from the basic function is the same. What do you think of when we talk about electric vehicles?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was over in the US a few weeks back and went to the Detroit Motor Show where Ford had their F-150 Lightning on display, and actually they were taking people around a circuit driving in it. And the acceleration of that vehicle was just absolutely incredible. It was basically 0 to 100 kilometres an hour in around 4 seconds. It was the effect is instantaneous. But the interesting thing is that the Ford F-150 Lightning is roughly the same size as their internal combustion engine. So what you're finding is that the Americans have still got incredibly big cars. In fact, they call them trucks, and they should, because they are. It's just that they're becoming electric. So I think that's an American phenomenon. I don't know whether we'd see it in Australia as much, but look, it's for all the reasons I mentioned before as well about the fact that you've now got these massive batteries that are running around the network, both drawing down and putting power back into the system. It's just going to be a completely different dynamic.
The owners of Ford 150 Lightnings, your traditional American big car owning tradies, are saying they love it much more than the old one. The old one had 2 tons of steel at the front and a light back, and so trying to manage this beast was difficult. This has got batteries in the center of the body, and it handles apparently beautifully with a stack load of power. And they're saying we love it to work with, but we love taking it off road on the weekends. It's just a great vehicle, and a surprise Ford. They sold out a year's production in something like 23 seconds online. Vehicle's different. Are they likely to be better for roads? I'm back to roads again because you are Roads Australia.
Yeah.
Is it better to be? Is that going to be better for the roads? Are they going to need less maintenance when you don't have this clunky old vehicle chewing up the rear ends of the cars with the weight at the front or something?
Look, I look from an environmental perspective and emissions perspective. Certainly, yes, but not in terms of the wear and tear on a road. I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference. I mean, a car that can accelerate to 100 k's an hour in 4 seconds is still going to do a bit of damage to the car, to the road.
You're driving around. Don't tell me you were driving around. They gave you the keys in Detroit. They didn't do that.
Unfortunately not, no. In fact, they wouldn't let me behind the steering wheel. But the interesting thing about the F-150 Lightning is that it has a thing called a frunk, which is where all the tradies put their tools in. But while they're driving around,
the front trunk, and
the tools are actually being charged as they're driving around. So when they get to the next job, all the tools are ready to go. They're all charged because, of course, the days of having extension leads and whatever are coming to an end.
It also means that these batteries on these computers on wheels can provide a whole lot of data to city planners, to people everywhere. And they can really understand what distance of people are travelling, where they're travelling to, what's going on. Much more than now. Certainly, the tag systems have made that possible. But I gather that the city planners of the future are going to have so much information to work with based on these smart cars. Yeah,
look, it's interesting in that a few years back, I think we were getting into the equivalent of an arms race with the automated vehicles, and it was going to be all over by 2018. Everybody would be being ferried around in an automated vehicle. Now that hasn't happened, and there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is social license. The confidence of the community to actually allow these vehicles on the road. But what we're seeing now is a much greater focus on connected vehicles. And so what that means is that vehicles that are travelling some kilometres apart on a particular highway are still talking to each other. So they're getting data on where potholes might be, which of course means that data can also be fed back to the road owner, be it the government or a private infrastructure company. But it also means that if there's an accident coming up, that sort of data is communicated to other cars across the network who can then take evasive action, go a different route, slow down, whatever that might be. And so technically you should have greater flow of traffic, but also potentially less accidents, because there'll be greater predictability across the network as to exactly what's happening.
Yeah, well, that would just be fantastic. I live on the Gold Coast, driving to Brisbane, you get halfway there and you come to a halt because there's some sort of thing. And my car tells me there's an alert, but doesn't quite tell me how bad it is. I mean, it's a whole new world, isn't it? It's just going to be terrific. Autonomous vehicles is interesting, though. I mean, Rio Tinto has been running massive trucks in their Pilbara operations for years now, hundreds of thousands of kilometres, no accidents, nothing at all, no problem with no drivers. But the social licence is an issue.
Look, I think that, as a father of, well, they're not young anymore, but the idea of pulling up at a traffic light next to an 18-wheeler and looking up and not seeing anyone behind the steering wheel, I think is a little bit daunting. And, so I think eventually we will get to the stage, for example, there will be truck lanes down the Hume Highway that are populated by driverless heavy vehicles. And in fact, I think you will even see it across the network in Melbourne and Sydney and other places where trucks may be driving at night where there's less traffic on the roads that are automated. But that issue of social licence where governments are prepared to allow it to happen, I personally think that the capability will be there long before the approval's given.
Well, that's already the case. I mean, we don't need a pilot on a plane at all. We know that. We can bomb the crap out of another country without any pilot. So we can certainly fly without a pilot. It's just no one wants to get onto a plane without one. So it's a mental thing. Paul Hodson, who's the co-host of another podcast we do, says that one day our great-grandchildren will come up to us and say, did you really let humans drive a car? Wasn't that dangerous? When they're distracted by, doing their hair or changing the radio station, isn't that just mad? And we'll say, yeah, that was just crazy. Yeah. And they'll say, wasn't it dangerous? You say, it was insanely dangerous. We killed lots of people. Yeah. But it took us a long time to change our attitudes on it.
Yeah. Doug, look, totally agree with that. I mean, I think that in the future, kids will say that they'll be just absolutely amazed that people were ever allowed to get behind the steering wheel and drive a car. I mean, I don't think it's too far in the future that, internal combustion engines and other cars that require a human to drive it will be a bit like a horse in that people will still have them. They might even actually use them on a weekend, but you wouldn't be taking it to work or doing anything, from a business perspective on it. It's just one of those things that people will have as a weekend activity.
The transport manager of PepsiCo in Seattle was on a podcast that I listened to, and she was saying that they have 20,000 vehicles in the west coast of, and they're moving trucks. You know those trucks that have the A-frames on the side, and you put the Pepsi and deliver it, and they're moving over to electric vehicles. And one area in which they're saving money is that the trucks can be charged up overnight. They don't need to be refueled. Currently, they need to refuel, and it takes about half an hour to refuel every day during the shift. So that's 20,000 multiplied by 30 minutes, so 10,000 hours, 5 days a week, 50,000 hours they're picking up just on the act of refueling, let alone fuel, and not having mufflers, not having all the other stuff that you no longer have in electric vehicles. Yeah. It's staggering, and we're going to start soon seeing that it's economical sense. It's good business sense to go to electric vehicles, not just some environment thing.
Yeah, just on that, James. I think it's interesting to note too that there's a big focus on the energy industry, obviously, in terms of emissions, and of course we've got a big focus now on renewables and doing away with some of that. Heavy emitting generation capacity. But, of course, transport itself is still accounting for nearly 20% of the total emissions, and a lot of that is actually in light vehicles. And so from a transport perspective, we're expecting that the focus of governments will start to turn towards the transport industry as being the next big thing that really needs to be discussed and thought about.
Which brings me to probably our last point, because we've taken a lot of time. Multimodal. I know that you've been looking at this for a little while. This is the idea of using hub and spoke type operations. We've seen WellCamp in Toowoomba open the airport. There's going to be a Western Sydney airport at Bradfield, the new city in Bradfield. Avalon's opened already, and there's multimodal hubs happening everywhere. Is that the future? And is there going to be clusters of businesses around those multimodals? Is that the way that we see it happening? I ask this from a business point of view so that the business people listening can get an idea about what the thinking is around this.
Yeah, good question. And look, the whole idea of multimodal hubs around rail networks or rail hubs has been one that's really gained some traction over the years, and perhaps one of the more well-known ones is Moorebank in Sydney, which is basically between Port Botany out to Moorebank, and you can then put it on another rail network or on a truck. And of course, the Western Sydney Airport has been designed with a very similar concept in mind, in that it's basically going to be a bit of a hub for goods that are coming and going from Sydney. Personally, I think it comes back to the issue of what's the most efficient way to move your goods, or people for that matter. And generally, you'd like to think that in a country like Australia, with a good rail network, that some of the heavier containers could certainly be moved by rail and then distributed from an intermodal hub. And where you're really starting to see it, I think, is on inland rail between Melbourne and Brisbane. There's a big debate now happening in both Brisbane and also Melbourne about where the intermodal hub needs to go. And, of course, there will be significant benefits attached to that. If you happen to be based near the intermodal hub that's going to go out in Western Melbourne, then you'll be doing pretty well.
Watch this space is the answer. All right, we better go. One last question for you. Tennant Reid, who was on our last podcast, he's the head of environment and energy at AI Group. He says that maybe autonomous vehicles won't happen because there are so many regulations to do with councils and state. It'll just be easier to start again, and so we'll see flying cars rather than cars driving along roads. He says it kind of cheekily, but he's a fan of the Jetsons. Do you think are we going to see flying cars?
Oh, look, I think we will, and the whole idea of drones, taxi drones, is already being talked actively about in Melbourne. But personally, I think that the road network will have longevity, mainly because it's still a fairly simple, safe way of moving people and freight around the city. Once you start getting movement into a three-dimensional space, it just becomes a little bit more tricky. So, yes, it will happen, but no, I'm a great believer that the road network that we have with us will certainly look very, very different in the future, but it's here to stay.
We'll ask your grandkids what it looked like. We'll sit back and watch what they do. And they'll do amazing things. I read this great quote the other day that said, never again will the pace of technology be as slow. The pace of change of technology will be as slow as it is today. Yeah. Isn't that just frightening? Yeah,
it is very true.
It's going to all happen. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. We didn't get to micro-mobility or all sorts of stuff, but if you don't own a car, perhaps you should get a scooter or something like that.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'll look into it.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.